Okay, so I would like to inform everybody that this meeting is currently being recorded, and by staying in this meeting, you agree to the recording. So I'm now going to give an input on how to write a publishable paper with a focus on how to write the introduction. Now, in the interest of full disclaimer, what I am going to discuss are mainly lifted from the inputs of our research capability training under the late Dr. Roberto Padua. So it was actually Dr. Padua who trained us, no, the core group of researchers, and most of the items that we have here in our discussion is coming from his training. Okay, so now when we talk about writing a publishable paper, we start by appreciating that what we are going to have, what the output rather that we will be having for this semester is a journal publication or a publishable paper, not the thesis, okay? Not the thesis that we normally see or that we have maybe experienced in senior high or junior high, for example. So how is a formal thesis different from a journal publication? Just to set the appreciation as early as now. These are the salient differences between a formal thesis and a journal publication. A thesis or a dissertation is detailed, okay? Meaning to say the focus is technical correctness. The aim or the purpose of a thesis or a dissertation is to illustrate that you are academically prepared to do a research. However, in the case of journal publication, the purpose is to inform a technical reader about a new result. Okay, it is not very detailed, meaning to say the technical details are no longer presented because the assumption in journal publication is that the reader is already technically knowledgeable. There is no need for you to prove that you are academically prepared to do the research. Okay, we are already assuming that since you have done a thesis in the past, in your senior high, for example, that you are already academically prepared. Okay, another salient difference is that if you would notice the way the chapters are arranged in a thesis or a dissertation, it uses a question and answer style of presentation, in that the questions are given in chapter 1 and they are answered in chapter 4. However, in the case of a journal publication, writing is more comprehensive. Okay, we only present the main research problem. After presenting the main research problem, the researcher is free to explore the problem later when the data are analyzed. So unlike a thesis wherein we outline all of the questions we would like answered, and then afterwards we answer each of the questions that we have outlined, there is more flexibility in terms of journal publication. Only the main research problem is presented. Should you wish to explore it further, then you can do that when the data is already analyzed. So here's the general structure of a research article following the IMRAD format. So in the IMRAD format, we of course will start with the title, the abstract, and the keywords. The abstract and the keywords we expect you to plug in part 2 already of the paper when you're completing it. Okay, then of course we have the introduction, the methods, the results, and discussion. So that is where the IMRAD is sourced from. Introduction, methods, results, and discussion. And finally, conclusion, references, and whatever supplementary data or appendices you may deem necessary to be part of your paper. So this is the general structure of the research article. Note again that for your research proposal, you're only expected to submit the title, the introduction, and the methods. Okay, results, discussion, and conclusion will all happen in part 2 of your research journey. Okay, now what about the length of the manuscript? So we are citing some literature here to provide us a guide on the length of the manuscript. According to Borja, here are some general guidelines. The title should be short and informative. The abstract is generally one paragraph, less than 250 words, but again, this will depend on the editorial policy. Some journals, they will require less than 200, others even less than 150 words. Okay, for the introduction, we will only be needing 1.5 to 2 pages. So in our case, we would normally ask that your introduction be no more than 3 pages, but as a general guideline, introduction should be 1.5 to 2 pages. The method section will be 2 to 3 pages, and sometimes this will already include the conceptual framework. The results will be 6 to 8 pages, depending on the results of your analysis. Discussion will be 4 to 6 pages. So results and discussion together would be about 10 to maybe 14 pages. The conclusion, generally 1 paragraph, okay, or half a page. And for the figures, we talk about charts, tables, etc. 6 to 8 or yeah, 6 to 8 figures, one per page. Tables would be 1 to 3, one per page as well. References, there have been questions before. How many literature must we read between 20 to 50 pages? 20 to 50, not pages, 20 to 50 papers, 20 to 50 articles. So since there are usually 5 members to a team, so between 5 to 10 research articles per member would already be a good database for you. Okay, so these are just some general guidelines coming from Borja on the length of your manuscript. But as promised, our main topic actually for today will be about how to write the introduction. So the introduction of a publishable paper is made up of 4 parts, okay? So the first part will answer the question, what are you trying to say? Okay, what do you want to do? What are you saying? So what you say, what the researcher is saying. Part 2 is what others have said. And essentially, it is in part 2 where your review of related literature would come in. Okay, so part 1 is what you are saying. Part 2 is what others have said. And comparing what you are saying with what others have said, you must be able to successfully draw out the gap. Okay, so when we talk about the gap, meaning what has not yet been studied in the literature, what has not yet been explored in the literature, or perhaps what has not been thoroughly explored yet. And so you may want to explore the other facets or the other areas or the other aspects that have not yet been thoroughly explored. And finally, what is your contribution to the pool of knowledge? That is the 4th part. So whenever your panelists would ask you, what is your contribution to the pool of knowledge? That is one way of asking, what do you plan to do with the gap? How do you plan to address the gap? Okay, so say for example, you wanted to look at, let's just say, I think there was a group that wanted to look at grit, no, in terms of grit in accountancy students. And we have already seen so many papers, so many articles, so many studies about grit being looked at from the professional level, talking about those in medical courses, for example, or talking about grit from the level, for example, of elementary and high school students, etc. Perhaps there was no clear study yet on grit from the college level, or no clear study yet, no clear model yet on grit in the tertiary level. And that's the gap that you have found. And what you plan to do with it is to come up with a model, okay, that will reflect grit and maybe perhaps the influence of grit, on tertiary students. So that's what you plan to do with the gap. So these are the 4 important parts of an introduction. Let's take a look at these parts one by one. So the first part of the introduction answers only one key question, and the question is, what is the study about? Okay, this is what you are trying to say. What is your study about? In order for you to answer that question, you need to brainstorm, and you need to brainstorm some more, and you need to brainstorm even more. Okay, so that's why it's very important for you to work closely with your team and with your advisor, because it is only through brainstorming that you could fine tune the ideas that you have for your paper. Please remember that journal space is not unlimited. That being said, make your article as concise as possible. Make sure to include only that which is considered to be essential. Okay, remember the principle of parsimony: more talk, more mistakes; less talk, less mistakes. But then, of course, we cannot say no talk, no mistakes, right? We do need to talk because we're coming up with a research paper. The idea here is that you have to be able to choose only the most essential concepts that you would like your readers to latch on. Okay, so that is the first part. Now, do you know that Nature, the world's #1 index journal, accepts only papers not exceeding 3 pages? And journals with high impact factors limit the number of pages to a maximum of 10. So this only shows you how important it is for you to get to the point, right? In terms of writing your research paper. Like what we have said, the first part of the research paper will answer the question, what is your study about? So maybe as a tip, you may want to write the answer to the question, what is your study about, at the end of the first paragraph. And then work your way up to the first sentence of the paragraph. Okay, the last sentence of the paragraph serves as your compass in writing. So let's show an illustration to this one. Okay, so for example, The last sentence may be that this study models the spread of HIV in the city of Cebu and uses the model to predict the AIDS cases in the city by 2020. So this is what your study wants to do, right? This is actually your contribution to the pool of knowledge. This is what you plan to do with the gap. So to model the spread of HIV in the city of Cebu. The second to the last sentence might state that although statistical data on HIV incidence in Cebu point to an alarming 7% incidence rate, no scientific model has been developed for public health policy purposes. Notice that this statement actually spells out the gap, right? So after reading through the literature, you found out that no scientific model has yet been developed. That's why in the last sentence, you are saying, my contribution to the pool of knowledge is to come up with this model. Okay. Then the third to the last sentence might be that the World Health Organization warned of the unprecedented rise in HIV cases, particularly among developing countries in the world. And the fourth to the last sentence, which in reverse will become your first sentence, would say that the Groot et al. Averred that AIDS is a disease that spreads as a function of the lifestyle of people across the globe. So if you will now stitch these together, in order to come up with an introduction, okay, and sorry, then you will have a first sentence that basically defines what is acquired immune deficiency syndrome, okay? Then stitch this one together. So if you read even just this one paragraph, you will be able to clearly see the four parts of the introduction. So to stitch it together, we have acquired immune deficiency syndrome is a communicable disease caused by human immunodeficiency virus, which damages the human immune system. The Groot et al. Averred that AIDS is a disease that spreads as a function of the lifestyle of people across the globe. The World Health Organization warned of the unprecedented rise in HIV cases, particularly among developing countries in the world. And although statistical data on HIV incidence in Cebu point to an alarming 7% incidence rate, no scientific model has been developed for public health policy purposes in the country. This study models the spread of HIV in the city of Cebu and uses the model to predict the AIDS cases in the city by 2020. So notice that we have a very concise introduction, but it includes all of the four parts of an intro. What the study, what you are saying. So you're basically saying that AIDS is a communicable disease that is a function of of one's lifestyle, as confirmed by the literature, what others have said. So we have cited the Groot, we have mentioned statistics from Harvard Center for Communicable Diseases, statistics coming from World Health, from the Department of Health and such. We have outlined the gap being that there is no scientific model that has been developed for public health policy purposes in the Philippines, and how you address the gap. Your contribution to the pool of knowledge is to come up with a model, okay, that will attempt to model the spread of HIV in Cebu City by 2020. So a very concise introduction. All four parts are here. Okay, so this is an example of how we're going to stitch the four parts together. So again, since part one is what is the study about, please do not forget, be considerate to your future readers. Remember, they are probably busy. Therefore, be parsimonious, keep it concise. The main thesis of your study is found in this section. When we talk about the thesis of your study, this is what you are trying to prove or disprove. Okay, so your main research problem, therefore, is found in this section. And then after that, since you have already outlined what is your main research problem, we then go towards what others are saying, right? They're basically likening research to joining a conversation of scholars. So it is actually in part two that we join this conversation. So the second part answers the question, what do other authors say about the topic? Now, as a word of caution, please do not flood your literature review with so many definitions of the same item. Like I have seen perhaps a research paper, the entirety of the literature review was just a definition of audit quality coming from different authors. That will not suffice. No, that is not the literature review that we mean. So what do other authors say about the topic? We take guidance from Colley. The literature review should compare and contrast different views on an issue, not simply different definitions, but different views. So if you're going to present differing definitions or multiple definitions, the reason for that must be that there are contrasting definitions, and I'd like to highlight this fact. But if what you're simply doing is enumerating the definitions, that will not count, okay, as a literature review. You may decide to group authors to draw similar conclusions, so it will be easier for you to point out what are points of similarities and contrasts. You may also want to criticize aspects of methodology. So perhaps they have been using a particular model, but you think structural equation would be a better fit. So you may criticize aspects of methodology to draw out the gap. Note areas in which authors are in disagreement, because if authors do not seem to agree on a certain area, then that could be a source of a gap for you. That's why you're kind of saying, yes, we're going to jump in and contribute to this conversation because they have not yet decided which one is more likely true than the other. So then there's still something there for you to contribute. Highlight exemplary studies, or those which we call seminal studies, studies which we consider to be original. No? So these are considered exemplary studies. Highlight gaps in research. It's very important in proving to the panelists that there is reason for you to do your research if you're able to highlight the gap. Show how your study relates to the previous studies, and show how your study relates to the literature in general. All of these things, showing how your study relates to previous studies or that the literature in general, will again help prove that there is a reason and a purpose for your study. Afterwards, you may conclude by summarizing what the literature says. So if you can imagine, it's kind of like arranging your literature in themes. That is why it's very helpful for you to have a literature map, so that from the map in itself, you could already draw out which articles are basically saying the same things and which articles somehow are in contradiction with each other. And so therefore, in what area of the literature can you find a gap? So here are some helpful tips. The literature must pertain to the topic mentioned in part 1, and you would not guess how many articles we have read whose literature seems to be disconnected from what the study actually is about. So make sure that whatever you read is related to the topic that you have mentioned, or what you said your topic is about in part 1. Be guided by your research objective and by the main research problem or by the thesis of your paper. We don't just blindly and randomly read literature. It has to be chosen because it will help lead you to your research objective and the thesis of your paper. Arrange your literature review in invisible themes. I mean to say, map your literature review. What do I mean by invisible themes? That means you don't need to put a subheading. Okay, for every group of literature that you have read, there's no need for you to do that. Okay, just arrange it in invisible themes. Make sure that it is an easy read and that people who read your literature review can follow the story and your line of thinking. How many? Well, we have already stated as a general rule, between 20 to 50, since there's 5 of you. So at a minimum, 5 articles per researcher. You can even go to as much as 10 articles. So the more literature you have reviewed, the stronger your paper actually becomes. Okay. Other helpful tips: your literature review should be a synthesis and an analysis of the relevant published work. Please remember, it must be linked at all times to your own purpose and rationale. So whatever you have written in your research article review or your literature review must at all times be linked to what you plan to do, or what you said your study was going to be about. Okay. Now, also avoid, although I think this one will not be much of a problem for you, avoid excessive self-citations. It's like when researchers keep on citing their own work, and excessive citations of publications from the same region. Say, for example, all of your articles come from researchers in India or are about topics and phenomena in, for example, India. No? So make sure that there is no excessive citation of publications from the same region. There has to be a variety of articles, okay, and jurisdictions that you have read up on. Other helpful tips for this one, and very important, of course, is to cite. That is why we have invited our very helpful librarians to give an orientation to you with regards proper citation. Okay, but still, here are some useful APA tips in terms of quotations and citations. Please remember, in order to avoid plagiarism, you have to indicate who said what, when, and where. Okay, so we should not copy the work of others. When what you are saying is actually the thought of another person, you have to make sure to properly cite. Okay, now when you include information from an outside source, you will typically either paraphrase the original author's words, meaning to say you need to change both the content and the form of the information you read. You cannot simply right click synonym and then or reshuffle the words like from passive to active voice. Okay, you cannot use simply substitution of synonyms. You have to change both the content and the form of the information that you have read. Now, in-text citation is very important. In-text citation should include the author's last name and the year of publication. Okay, you may also use a direct quote. It's possible for you to use a direct quote. When you use a direct quote, you write down exactly what was written in the original text. And then you will use quotation marks, or my students used to call this one bunny ears. So use quotation marks. The in-text citation, if you are using a direct quote, please take note of this additional requirement. The in-text citation must include the page number of the original source along with the author's last name and the year of publication. Okay, so let's present some examples for in-text citation. For example, according to Smith, and then that's the last name of the author, and then include the publication year, life can be pretty exciting. Or life can sometimes be pretty exciting. Okay, then Smith, 1989. Or Yahoo. So notice in the case of Yahoo, it is enclosed in bunny ears or quotation marks. That means that that is a direct quote. That is exactly how Smith said it. And because we are using a direct quote, we have to include the page number. So Smith, 1989, and then page 3. Okay? Or talking about life, Smith said Yahoo. And again, because it's a direct quote, we have to include or indicate the page number. Now, by way of you, or in order for you to determine if the use of the parenthetical notations for the year of publication is correct, just remember that whatever is enclosed in the parentheses will be read silently. Okay, so some researchers, some students make the mistake of including, for example, the family name in the parenthetical notation. For example, in the case of the first illustration we have, some would say according to, and then enclosed Smith, comma, 1989 in the parentheses. If I'm going to read that out loud, it's going to be according to. Life can be pretty exciting because whatever you put inside the parentheses will be read silently. Okay, so make sure that you make use of the parentheses correctly. Whatever is inside there will be read silently. Okay, so those are just some APA tips on how you cite. So for example, in the search for literature, for example, in the previous illustration we had, what studies about HIV should you review? Well, number one, you did say that your study is about developing a model for the spread of HIV. Therefore, you should include epidemiologic models for communicable diseases. Notice that the researcher did not only search for HIV, but the researchers searched for epidemiological models for communicable diseases being the umbrella for HIV, right? So it is not, this is, I think, one of the usual problems we encounter when we search for literature. Because if the study, for example, is about HIV, then we only search HIV. No, but then HIV is a form of a communicable disease. So we also need to read up on communicable diseases. Another, the study will utilize the model for public health policy purposes, right? That was what the researcher told us. Therefore, you can also include studies that relate to public health policies to the control of communicable diseases. So again, not only limited to HIV, but communicable diseases as a whole. Okay. The most common mistake, this is what we have been saying, is to review studies about HIV or AIDS that have nothing to do with the models or public policy. That is why it's important for us to always anchor our literature review on what the main research problem is. Right? So for example, this could be a good second paragraph. The most common epidemiologic model for the spread of communicable diseases uses the compartmentalized susceptibles infectious recovered model by Devaney Yamasaki. No, such models are useful for controlling the spread of communicable diseases since one can concentrate on any one or two compartments at any given time. So notice that the articles that were read were not specific to HIV or AIDS, but rather to models of communicable diseases. Okay, so don't forget, in terms of part 2, what do other authors say about the topic? This is essentially our literature review. Choose your literature wisely, arrange them into themes, discuss, analyze, note similarities, draw out differences. Do not simply list down what you have read. Okay, it has to be an analysis, a synthesis of what you have read. And in order to avoid plagiarism, remember that citation is very important. Okay, so for example, if the study, for example, is, or if the article you have read, for example, has the title Academic Integrity, a quantitative analysis of confidence and understanding in students at the start of their higher education. So this was an actual article authored by Philip Newton. Publication date was March 27, 2015. This is the original text. Positive correlations were found between confidence, performance, and recommended penalties, suggesting that confident students did better on tests of simple tests of referencing and recommended more severe penalties for transgressions of academic integrity. This is interesting. Confident students call for more severe penalties for transgressions of academic integrity. These correlations were supported by findings that new postgraduates were more confident than new undergraduates, recommended more severe penalties, and performed better in simple tests of referencing. So based on this literature, it would seem that the more confident you are, the more stringent you wish the penalties to be. So if you want to paraphrase this one, then perhaps you could state positive correlations were found between confidence, performance, and recommended penalties, suggesting that confident students did better in tests of simple tests of referencing and recommended more severe penalties for transgressions of academic integrity. Okay, so that could be a way for you to paraphrase it. Or you may say, according to Newton, positive correlations, or this is a common mistake in basically synthesizing this one. Take note that there was no citation and basically just repeated the words being used in the original text. So not a good example. A better way of paraphrasing it would be, according to Newton, okay, so there was a proper citation. Positive correlations were found between confidence, performance, and recommended penalties, suggesting that confident students did better in tests of simple tests of referencing and recommended more severe penalties for transgressions of academic integrity. Okay, or according to Newton, okay, confident students did better on tests of simple referencing. Optimistic correlations were found between self-assurance, performance, recommended penalties, and more severe penalties for transgressions. Okay, so these are basically the more important concepts that we wanted to highlight from that particular literature. All right, so the third and fourth paragraph, well, the success of the third and fourth paragraph will depend on how well you have done your literature review. So what are the gaps in knowledge with respect to the topic, and what do you plan to do with the gap in the knowledge? Believe it or not, it is actually the gap in the knowledge that becomes a main source of question becomes a main source of discussion during the proposal hearing. And sometimes you get to see very weak gaps because the literature review was not done very thoroughly. So many times we have seen anemic literature reviews. So please make sure that you have done a very strong literature review so that your gap will also be very pronounced. Okay, and what do you plan to do with the gap? Another way of asking that is, what is your contribution to the pool of knowledge? So the third part answers the question, what are the gaps? The determination of the gap can be tricky as it requires thorough knowledge of the subject matter, and perhaps at this point, this is where your advisor would come in handy, because the advisor is deemed to be an expert in terms of the subject matter. So the gap in knowledge is the one that identifies whether there really is a need to conduct the study and will be the one to justify part 1. Okay, so you're saying that this is what I wanted to do. We need to see a gap for us to know that that must be done. Okay, so that's the importance of the gap. So for example, this was part 1, right? What do you want to do? Or what is the study about? The study models the spread of HIV. Part two, we read through the literature, the articles about communicable diseases and modeling that have been used for the communicable diseases. So the models that have been reviewed revealed that the main focus of the models is on the relative changes in the sizes of the compartments of SIR, which is basically coming from the literature that was read. The models have not taken into consideration how these relative sizes are influenced by the social lifestyles of the people under consideration. And so that one spells out the gap, right? There have been so many models already, and we have read so many articles already, but then what we have read has not taken into consideration how the sizes are affected by lifestyles. Sorry, and so that becomes your gap. Another example. This paper develops a theory on the psychological reasons behind a person's gossip tendencies. And for part two, perhaps you have read about the varying contrasting definitions of gossip. What is positive and negative gossip? What are conditions in the environment that will give rise to gossip? And what are the functions of gossip? So this is this basically is the content of your literature review. And so to draw out the gap, we say evident in most of the studies made about gossip is its concentration on evolutionary origins, social-cultural perspective, and its underpinnings on human interactions. These studies have not explored the individual psychological motivations for engaging in such. And so then that becomes the gap in knowledge. Once you were able to identify the gap, the fourth part then addresses the question, what do you plan to do with the gap in knowledge? So this is a sketch of the idea that one wishes to try out in response to the gap in knowledge. Now, please do not discuss the methods of research in this part, okay? So the research methodology has its own section. So do not discuss the methods in this part. Let's show an example. Remember this example? Part one, what your study is about. Part two, what others have said. Part three, we have outlined the gap. Part four, we'll read something like this. Social lifestyles, such as multiple sexual partnerships, commitment, protected sex practices, and health checkups are lifestyle factors that can impact the rate at which entry into any of the compartments of SI or D slows or accelerates. Functional relationships between these social parameters and the disease parameters will be determined in the final model to be developed in this study. You don't talk about the methods, you don't talk about who you're going to interview, if you're going to perform a survey or say, for example, a focus group discussion. You don't mention that here. You just basically give us an overview of what you plan to do with the gap. In this case, the plan of the researcher is to explore the social parameters in the final model to be developed. Another example, remember this paper, the one on gossip? The gap was that there has been no a study that has explored the individual psychological motivation. And so therefore, what is your contribution to the pool of knowledge? The researchers posit that psychological constructs such as an individual's self-concept and anxiety levels are factors that can affect a person's gossip tendencies. Relationships among these factors will be explored in the theory to be developed in this study. No mention of the methods, okay? So we do not discuss the methods in this section. Just give us a very broad overview of what is your contribution to the pool of knowledge. Okay, so those basically are the four parts, what your study is about, what others have said about your topic. What is the gap? What have you noticed to be the blind spot? What have you noticed to be the blank spot? What has not yet been studied? What has not yet been studied thoroughly? Okay, and the fourth one is what is your contribution to the pool of knowledge? Okay, so having said that, it is now your turn to prepare and create the introduction for your research. As what we have said, generally it will be 1.5 to 2 pages, but since this is still the first draft that we will be having in submission to the proposal, what we're asking you is to prepare a 3-page full introduction to your own research paper, following the format we have just seen. Remember the 4 parts, okay? Now, the 4 parts may interact seamlessly with each other. It doesn't have to be very rigid that the first paragraph has to be part 1, the second paragraph has to be part 2. Doesn't have to be very rigid. However, when we read the introduction, it must be clear that the 4 parts are present. Okay, and generally the third part and the fourth the last part will be presented, of course, as the fourth part, because that will be the one that will usher in the discussion of the CF and the RDM as well. Okay, so these are the four parts of your research paper. Please, only a maximum of 3 pages. Okay, now for your paper, I mean for the rather for the dimensions that you would need to use, please make sure to utilize Times New Roman. I know we are not a very big fan of that font, but it's one of the accepted fonts for APA. So make use of Times New Roman, font size 12, and then 1 inch margin all around. The spacing should be 1.5. Okay, so I forgot to place that here, but just as a reminder again, Times New Roman, font size 12, 1 inch margin all around, spacing should be 1.5, page size should be 8.5 by 11, not A4. Okay, not A4, but the traditional short size, 8.5 by 11. All right, so that's about it. That will be our input for writing the introduction. At this point, allow me to stop the recording so that I could address your questions if there are any.